Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to the New Books Network. My name is Matthew Jordan, and I'm an instructor at McMaster University, a historian of science, and a funk musician. I am extremely pleased today to be joined by Adam Rutherford, a geneticist and science communicator par excellence, whose recent book, How to Argue with a Racist, History, Science, Race, and Reality, will be the subject of our discussion today. Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to talk to you, Matthew.
Well, let's just get started. You have written many books in your long and storied career as a science communicator. Why did you want to write this one?
It's not that long. I'm not that old. I'm in my mid-40s. Anyway, I think the real answer is I didn't. I just felt compelled to. Like many geneticists, what I'm really interested in is DNA and genes and evolution and that sort of stuff. But my work as a science communicator has taken me down the route of explaining, this incredibly complex subject, which we really are only just beginning to understand, which is the human genome, genetics, evolution, stuff like that, right? So that's my passion. But the last book but one, which was called A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, I wrote a chunky chapter about the history of race in relation to genetics, because the two things are inherently intertwined, and also to do with the fact that I was and still am at UCL, where many of the key ideas in scientific racism, and particularly a separate but related domain, which is eugenics, were founded at UCL. And I indeed was in the Galton Laboratory, which no longer exists, founded by Francis Galton, Darwin's half cousin, who was the person who came up with the sort of formal doctrine and study of eugenics. So, inevitably, these pathways, my academic pathways, clashed at the point where I'm writing about human evolution and the history of genetics, and you can't avoid talking about race and, to a certain extent, eugenics if you're going to talk about the history of my subject. So that was in the previous book, and then what happened over the last that was released in 2016, I think it was, and since 2016, the whole political landscape of the Western world has shifted on its axis. We had the rise of populism and nationalism with Trump elected in the USA, with Brexit in the UK. And now 10 years of a right-wing government that is becoming progressively more right-wing. And the whole discourse about race just was propelled again right into the sort of front line of public discussions. And then there was another factor which sort of tied into this, which is the unpredicted rise of genetic ancestry testing kits. So things like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. And so there's this huge popular rise in understanding genetics or engaging with genetics as a subject in many ways that I find problematic, scientifically problematic. So it was like, the planets aligned or misaligned perhaps. And it felt that I really had little choice but to, really get stuck into the weeds of trying to help people understand the history of genetics, the history of human genetics, anthropology, and indeed how it ties up with scientific racism.
Yeah, this idea of scientific racism is somewhat of an interesting and counterintuitive one. Many people, I think, imagine racists when they think of the prototypical, stereotypical racist in their head. It's kind of an uneducated, maybe a kind of dim-witted person who is a bigot against another group of people. But what your book shows is that, there's this whole area of scientific racism where quite brilliant, highly educated, very sophisticated scientific thinkers were able to use genetics and other branches of science in order to spin a narrative about what race is and how it works, and how, of course, the white people, the Nordic race, as it were at the top. Maybe we can start with a bit of history, because it's so crucial to this story. You mentioned the role of University College London, the role of Francis Galton. Can you say a bit about those kind of early days of genetics, maybe this early inquiry into the heritability of different traits, and how that historical picture kicked off this idea of scientific racism.
Sure. I mean, I think actually we have to go maybe a century or two earlier than
Sure.
that, before we even get to the sort of much more formal study of evolution and inheritance that happens in the 19th and early 20th century. Because
Mhm.
it's not so much that the history of science is woven into the fabric of scientific racism and colonialism as well, because the two things are very, very closely intertwined. But it's actually at the base, it's at the foundation, because what you see as European colonizers are beginning to expand across the world, particularly into Africa, to extract resources in all forms, including the subjugation of people and as enslaved people. As that is happening from, the United Kingdom and other North European countries, we're also seeing the birth of what is sometimes fondly called the scientific revolution. We're in the age of enlightenment, and I think all of these terms are not without problems, but because it is also the age of plunder and the age of exploitation. And so what we see at this time is, as white Europeans are beginning to explore around the rest of the world with the intent of colonization, they are encountering people who from the rest of the world who look different to them. And as this is sort of coincident with the birth of the sort of more formal scientific methods, if you will, that we now enjoy, the scientific revolution, as I said a second ago, we have the attempts to categorize people. So the attempts to introduce classification, taxonomy into the whole of the natural world, and that includes humans. And so, I think maybe the most robust example of this is with Linnaeus himself, so the founding father of taxonomy, possibly the first proper biologist, the taxonomic system that we still use today in genus and species, Homo sapiens, or whatever. Now, in attempting to include Homo sapiens into his grand scheme, the book was called Systema Naturae, of which I think it's like more than 13 volumes published during his lifetime, in which he tries to describe all living things, plants, animals. He also tries to classify rocks in this, but that didn't really work out. He includes humans, and he includes 4 subspecies of humans. And the primary determinant of his descriptions of the 4 subspecies of humans is pigmentation, skin color. So there's Africanus, who have dark black skin, indigenous Americans, Americanus, who he describes as having red skin, Asiaticus, so people that we would now refer to as East Asians, who he describes as having yellow skin, and Europaeus, who he describes as having white skin. Now, following on from those initial phenotypic descriptions, which are deeply problematic in and of themselves, given how clumsy, and we now know that there's more pigmentation variation within Africa than in the rest of the world put together. Following on from those initial descriptors, you have some pretty hardcore value judgments associated with behavior. So things like behaviors being capricious, people being ruled by caprice or by customs, and the key. I don't want to get into the details of that because they're pretty offensive, and I find it quite troubling just to even read them out.
Sure.
But the fact is that what we have here is a classification which is 2 things simultaneously, well, maybe 3 things. 1, inaccurate. 2, absolutely laden with value judgments, so completely non-scientific in that regard. And 3, it's not merely classification, it's hierarchical. And in every single case, starting with Linnaeus or in fact others, but every single attempt by scientists or pseudoscientists of this time, thinkers, philosophers, to classify humans, they are all hierarchical, and see if you can guess who comes top of that hierarchy.
Right. Yeah, no, the one fascinating thing about this is recognizing just how new this idea of categorizing people based on what we maybe call race, but is really just skin color, is in terms of human history. There's some super interesting research in psychology and evolutionary psychology, which is sometimes a dubious field, but nevertheless suggesting that we are much more inclined to discriminate or have prejudices against people based on, for instance, the sound of their voice. We're very good at determining who's the insider versus outsider based on the way that they speak. Even very young, at a very young age, babies are able to do that far more than they're prejudiced against anyone based on the color of their skin. The reason being that for most of human history, no one was really encountering people of a different skin color necessarily. Whereas if you encountered someone, who lived slightly farther away, in the UK alone, the sound of someone's accent could be a very telling indicator of like who they were, and how they might relate to you. And so, like you said, this idea of even having a system whereby you would be classifying people according to any sort of like race-based system could only have arisen with this rise of kind of colonialism, travel, plunder, and this exploration of the world where people were coming into contact with people who did not look like them, which is a very recent thing in kind of the history of our species.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's a couple of things worth unpicking within that. The first is, as you just said, this is very recent, right? I think we have such short-term memories, and we don't know our own history well enough to. It takes pointing it out that actually the invention of race, as we currently understand it, as we currently use it as a social way of describing the people of the earth, is really only 300 or 400 years old tops. Now, that is not to say that people before the 17th century did not have, well, two things. One, bigotry, and two, ways of differentiating between people. So in-group, out-group, which is very much a part of human nature. It's just that the primary determinant is a physical characteristic of pigmentation, which becomes the basis of racial categorizations from the 17th century onwards, is, as you say, it really is invented at that time, with one possible earlier example during the Islamic slave trade era, described by Avicenna in the 12th century. Now, the descriptions of pigmentation in relation to people go back to the actual earliest Western texts.
Right.
Homer talks about pigmentation of different people in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Odysseus himself is described as sort of swarthy, and I was almost a classicist. I chose genetics instead. But there's one of the real problems in translating classical literature is assuming that there is a direct correlate for in contemporary language.
Right.
And so while there are plenty of descriptions of pigmentation and hair color as well and hair texture, they aren't necessarily a simple one-to-one mapping of, when Homer says Odysseus was swarthy, does that mean he had the same pigmentation as me or a Greek of that time? Or was it in reference to the fact that he was, a troubled man, a difficult man, he was capricious and blah, blah, blah. It does contain, the Iliad contains the word Aethiops to describe sort of broadly sub-Saharan African people, and that is where Ethiopia comes from. And that literally means Aethiops, it means blackened face. So there are plenty of descriptions of pigmentation in early literature, but none of them are as significant as classifiers as some of the things you mentioned, like language, like geography, like religion, like cultural practices. Skin color only becomes significant really in the age of enlightenment, the age of exploration, expansion, and plunder.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's this important distinction of, people have always noticed that other people in this world look differently to them in many different ways: skin color, hair color, height. But there's a very big difference between that and a Linnaean system of taxonomy, whereby like these different groups, first of all, have like firm delineated boundaries between them, and lead to some sort of hierarchical classification based on their intelligence or abilities or personality or anything like that. So when we're going through the history here, we're starting with this kind of classification. How does that then turn into this kind of eugenic movement about hierarchy of the races and the desire for, I don't know, the Nordic or the white race to be at the top? And maybe we can talk now about the role of Francis Galton and some others in that process.
Yeah, sure. So, racism is, or racisms, I should say, are are less about, name calling, which I think is what most people often assume is what is fundamentally racist, and much more about power structures and power structures that are associated with classification of people. And that's why the notion of being white remains the top of the hierarchy in racialized structural racism that we experience in up and down the Americas, in Canada, in the US, and indeed all over Europe, and in London, the UK, where I am right now. And so, this is pseudoscience, which is being marshaled into a political ideology, which is, in a literal sense, white supremacy. Not white supremacy in the sense of how we talk about white supremacists today, but it is that white people or white Europeans are better and therefore are entitled to subjugate the people that they encounter in the rest of the world. Now, from Linnaeus onwards over the next couple of hundred years, this is simply an idea which gets developed and reinforced by dozens of men of science or men of philosophy and political thinkers, many of whom are, the founding fathers of Western thought in many ways. So it's people like Kant. Do you want me to wait for that plane to pass?
No, it's all right.
I'll just keep going. Okay. People like Kant and Voltaire and Blumenbach in Germany. And all through the 18th, 19th century, you've got the continual development of these ideas of hierarchical classification. People like Blumenbach introduced new metrics, so it's not just reliant on skin color. Things like skull shape and phrenology and craniotomy become significant, what we now know are pseudoscientific terms for classifying people, and thus to justify their difference and subjugation. And then you get, 1859, we have the publication of The Origin of Species, and biology is turned completely upside down by what I believe is the most important book ever written. Yeah. And that changes the whole notion of how we think about heredity and biology and evolution and life on Earth. And that includes humans in principle. There's only one mention of humans in The Origin. But then Darwin goes on in 71, 81.
That sounds right to me. Yep.
71. To write The Descent of Man. Well, I really should know that by now. I've only been talking about this stuff for 25 years.
That's fine.
and it's his cousin. It's his, second cousin. It's his half cousin,
right?
Francis Galton, who absolutely worships Darwin as an intellectual, who picks up this idea and transfers many aspects of evolutionary theory onto humans and also the development of humans, but very much in a politicized way. Now, Galton is a fascinating, deeply problematic, genius character who needs to be studied more and more and more. And one thing that's emerged over the last few years is that this has been a core part of my academic upbringing because I was in the Galton lab, and it all happened at UCL, where I still teach. One thing I have realized recently is that this is not universally taught. And when I did my undergraduate degree at UCL in the Galton, which was 93, there was only one or two genetics courses in the whole of the UK. And now in 2020, it is a absolutely standard part of every single biology course in every single further education establishment on Earth. And I think my suspicion is, I'd like to quantify this, is that Galton is not as well known as I had presumed he was,
right?
With that huge bias in place that, I was only 2 or 3 generations directly descended from him himself. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so he develops these. Galton, apart from being a scientific genius and the creator of many of the statistical processes that we continue to use to this day, and a founding father of psychology and meteorology and forensics, and a debunker of phrenology because the data wasn't good enough for him, and effectively the founding father of human genetics. He was also unequivocally a colossal racist. So racist even for his time. Everyone was more racist in the Victorian era. It's useful that he was half cousins with Darwin, who, whilst not not being angelic in his expression about his expressions about people of the rest of the world, was an abolitionist, was incredibly liberal even for that time. And in contrast, you've got Galton, who was a full-on white supremacist, who truly believed in the inheritance of genius, of men. I guess his most well-known work is on the inheritance of genius, and it's a strange. I presume you've read it, right?
I have, yeah. Hereditary Genius.
Yeah,
It's I mean, the most fascinating thing about it is the whole point of that book is looking at, the children of imminent people and seeing, are those people imminent, and impressive themselves? And so the inevitable conclusion is just, imminence is heritable. And the level of detail in that book and in all of Galton's work is truly astounding.
yes.
I mean, the guy really cared about what he was doing and had an attention to detail and, kind of studying, I don't know, every imminent family in Britain and every poor family. And really, he did his due diligence, ill-founded though his motives were. The guy, you can't fault him for working hard to attempt to amass this data set, but really an unusual read.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and it's admirable. It's impressive how thorough his science is,
Right.
whilst never managing to get over the fact that his extreme prejudice is actually driving his as you say, diligence, incredible diligence. And the families he's analyzing in Hereditary Genius are politicians and bishops,
exactly,
and actors even. And I don't think there are any women in there whatsoever. I may be wrong about that, but it's such an incredibly skewed, prejudicial data set on which he bases this whole sort of thesis. But from this, and I'm not a Galton apologist. I think we need to be capable of recognizing incredible work that needs to be continued to be studied, and whose intellectual influence continues to this day, whilst recognizing that they also were terrible, terrible people, whose motivations may well have been terrible as well. And in fact, we see that following on from Galton in his disciples, who are people like Karl Pearson, another absolute founding father of statistics, who was the first Galton professor at UCL. And then the second Galton professor was Ronald Fisher. Fisher, who I would place in probably the top 5 most significant biologists of all time, who was also an astonishing racist and ardent eugenicist.
Yeah.
And so this, whilst being so fundamental to the revolution in biology that happens in the 1920s and 1930s, mostly centered around UCL, a legacy of which I suppose pride is not quite the right word. I think it's the trajectory of history is what we should be proud of in evolutionary genetics and the study of these subjects, rather than the history itself. And you're a historian. One of the key principles in modern history is not to judge people by contemporary standards.
Right.
Whilst at the same time, I think that sometimes gets used as a get-out clause for not actually scrutinizing brilliant people from history who also turned out to be terrible people.
Yeah.
Because you can contemporize their views. You can compare the views of Galton to Darwin or to politicians of that time and say Galton was more racist and more of a eugenicist than Darwin. Fisher was more racist and more a eugenicist than Haldane. Who was also in my top 5 of the most significant biologists of all time. So, there's so much public discussion at the moment about the value of universities and reassessing our own troubled pasts. And I do think we have to lead the way in being honest and overt and shining a light on people like Galton, people like Fisher and Pearson, and say that their intellectual contribution to our understanding of the universe is unmatched. And there's no way we can deny that. whilst at the same time saying that doesn't mean we have to celebrate these people as individuals, because they also not only were racist in a time of racism, but many of them had views which were extreme even for their time.
Yeah. One thing that's there's so much that you just said that we can get into. There are two things that maybe I'll just touch on a little bit. One is just recognizing, in terms of when you're talking about reckoning with, what is the role of science in the universities and who are these people who came before us? Like you said, just a couple generations ago, scientifically, right? This is not the deep past we're talking about. These people are very much alive in terms of the methods that they introduced to science being still very much part of our kind of our enterprise and our techniques. So much of statistics was founded by these folks, Galton, Pearson, and Fisher in particular, and our statistical techniques bear their names. And when you start asking the question, well, what, so many statistical tests are about telling the difference between two groups as being significant or not. And you got to think to yourself, well, what was the original purpose of that? What were these groups that we were trying to discriminate between and tell if they're different? Obviously, we now use those statistical techniques to determine, groups that are different in, a drug trial or some genetic scan. But back in the day, the things we were trying to determine the difference between were, group characteristics like intelligence and height and personality. Those were the initial kind of roles being served by these statistical techniques, with the ultimate aim of using this statistical knowledge to do eugenics, to have a process of controlled breeding and reproduction, and ensure that only the best people reproduce, so that in the eyes of folks like Galton, this kind of tree of eminent genius could continue unabated and untempered. So even, for instance, this idea of regression. Galton introduced regression in the sense meaning regression to the mean. That is to say, when people are super, super tall, their children will likely be a little bit less tall because, statistical values are always kind of tending toward the mean value. So that's where regression comes from. And the whole point of studying, people's height over time, it was kind of this detour en route to studying people's, intelligence over time, so that only the most intelligent people could have children with the other most intelligent people. And so that is just one of many, many examples. And that doesn't mean, our statistics are now like invalid or illegitimate, right? These are mathematical techniques that have important uses. But I think, like you say, there is a role. I guess maybe I'll just ask you, this kind of things that I'm talking about the eugenic roots of statistics. And for what it's worth, if you're looking for eugenic roots of academic disciplines, yes, you can go to genetics and statistics, but these things lurk in dark, dark corners. And if you go to environmentalism or conservation, what exactly were they trying to conserve and for whom? Once you start asking questions like that, it can get pretty disturbing pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I guess what is. Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
No, go on, ask the question. I have much to say on this matter.
Yeah. No, I was just going to ask you, what is the role of kind of disentangling? If in the present, for instance, maybe we believe in the present, genetics is people of all races and genders study genetics now. It's not a racist field. We know eugenics is bad. What is the role, I guess, of studying this history and talking about these things, and what can we learn from kind of digging into these, kind of dark roots of our scientific endeavor, the scientific endeavor that you and I and so many people love and think is amazing and beautiful and a wonderful way of learning about the world.
Yes. Well, it's the process that is wonderful, and that is the strength of science, rather than as a sort of monolithic thing in and of itself. I mean, we study this history in order to recognize, well, partly because it's fundamentally interesting, partly, as you say, because this stuff is only 100 years old. So astrophysics dates back to Babylonians who accurately clocked at least 6 of the planets. Whereas, and I know we've been talking about inheritance for the whole of human history, but as a sort of science, as a robust academic discipline, it really is a century old at its tops. So this is not ancient history at all. I was taught by people who were taught by Ronald Fisher. I know Fisher's last living PhD student, and
Right.
Fisher was taught by Galton. Right, that's not particularly unique to me, because the academic family trees branch all over the place. But the point is, I'm 2 generations away from these people in the actual locations where it happened. So, we need to understand the techniques because we still use them. We need to understand the history, partly because it's interesting, but partly also because it reveals something which I think is very important, which is that there is an absolute reflection of the structural racism that we see in society within science. And I think that most scientists don't realize this because it doesn't come up very often. But it comes up very overtly when you start talking about contemporary data sets of, for example, human genomes for studies such as genome-wide association studies, where actually we just know so much more about white Europeans than we do about anyone else on Earth, because that's where we've done the studies. Now, it's so obvious to point this out now because that's where the data sets are. But this does, in fact, skew the science, right? So if you want to forget the politics of it, forget the fact that having diversity in labs is a good thing. If you just want to do the best possible science, then you need to have diversity in your data sets, and you need to recognize that our data sets are not pure and simple because they were collected by people, and people are never pure and they're not simple, right? And so, you get sort of more right of center people saying things like, well, the data is the data. It's not, the data can't be biased. It can't be prejudiced because it's just data. Well, I just think that's fundamentally incorrect. And whilst it's a sort of noble aim of science, that our descriptions of reality are absolutely objective, as long as science is done by people, they cannot be. And I think it's really important that we recognize that the roots of our field have structural racism built into them in a way that is very obvious if you're talking about Galton or Fisher or all of those guys at the beginning of the 20th century. And, and we haven't even mentioned the people in the States who are influenced by this, nor the political ramifications of people like Galton and Pearson, which in their most extreme cases are the Holocaust. But just to recognize that these structural biases are built into the culture of science in such a way that they still resonate today. We've only really started looking at the genomes of African people in the last 5 years, which is an absurdity because almost all human evolution occurred in Africa. There is more genetic diversity, more differences between people within Africa than the rest of the world. And we will have a far, far deeper and greater and richer understanding of human evolution and human variation if we spend much more time studying the genomes of people within Africa. And yet, for the first 100 years of genetics as a field, it's not something we bothered with at all. So we know a lot about Europeans, and we don't know much about people of the rest of the world. The fact that we're aware of it is great because it means we're fixing it. But why these structural biases exist in the first place is important to both recognize and to tackle. And who knows? In 100 years' time, someone like you and someone like me will be having a discussion on some other format in which they'll be saying, yeah, and you remember those guys at the beginning of the 21st century in the era of the Human Genome Project, and how deeply did they screw up, this data set or whatever characteristic they were looking at, or, understanding of intelligence or behavioral genetics. They had no idea what they were doing, and yet it became the policy that would determine the 21st century. That is the process of science. I think that scientists need to know their history much better than we do.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is you're preaching to the choir. That is that is my life's mission. So I'll let you know how it goes, and I look forward to speaking in 100 years by telepathy about how much we screwed up in this year. Maybe well, first of all, I just want to touch on one thing you mentioned, which is a super important part of this story, which is that while a lot of these ideas do originate in the UK, as we mentioned, they kind of get shipped over to the United States, where many thinkers take this kind of very intellectual, pseudoscientific form of racism and statistics, eugenics, and in the United States, it really gets turned into full-fledged kind of policy and law, extremely coercive sterilization and anti-immigration laws. A truly disturbing history that I would recommend people look into more. We can't really talk about it too much because we have a lot more to cover. But folks like Madison Grant, Henry Fairfield Osborne, Samuel Morton, people who really most people have not heard of, but were true luminaries kind of in American history, and extremely popular and influential folks in their time. And we're kind of only learning, a lot of us are only learning about these people as we kind of think about, why is there a statue to this person, on the Princeton University campus or something like that? And we have to reckon with, okay, are these the people we want to be, memorializing? And then it was from there that Nazi Germany was influenced. So there's kind of this progression from the like British intellectuals to the American enactors to the Germans who really took it to a place that many of us are familiar with, and that is obviously represents kind of the lowest of the low in terms of human terribleness.
Yeah.
So
there's some really interesting nuances within this as well, which I find fascinating. And you, as a historian who specializes in eugenics, I know you know this stuff much better than I. But the fact that this idea is sort of formalized in central London by Galton and others, and Galton sets up the eugenics laboratory on Gower Street, which is where UCL is, and it becomes intrinsically linked with UCL forever. But the fact that it is eugenics is it's not the toxic idea that we think of it today. When it becomes formalized, it's an attractive idea. And I think one of the really interesting things is that there are differences between the histories of the UK and America, the USA, which are not insignificant in this conversation. Because whilst Galton was a very pronounced racist, as was Pearson, as was Fisher, when you read their works, when they're talking about eugenics, they do seem to be primarily concerned not with the elimination of racial categories of people, but more they're focused on class-based eugenics policies. That there's this perpetual idea that that poor people are reproducing at a far greater rate than middle class or upper class people. So you take Fisher, for example, and in his incredibly important seminal text, The Genetical Theory of Evolution, the first half of which remains some of the best scientific discourse that I've ever read, the second half of which is this bizarre, rambling diatribe about eugenics policies and how they should be implemented, and sort of lamenting the fall of the Roman Empire because the powerful and the rich didn't have enough kids, but the poverty-stricken had too many, and that's the decline of civilizations. So there's a very much class-based angle to eugenics, at least in the UK. And of course, we never had a eugenics policy. So close in 1912, where there was a clause in a particular bill that was put before the UK Parliament, which was removed by Josiah Wedgwood, and never made it to policy. So we never had official eugenics policies in this country, whereas in many countries in South America, in Sweden, and particularly in the States, as you say, they had aggressive actual policies. Now, the German thing, again, is also profoundly interesting. German people set up their version of national eugenics laboratories after visiting London and seeing what Galton and his descendants were doing. But yes, as you said, then they become significantly influenced by the enacted policies of various states. So I think it was 31 states had eugenics policies. Now, in the States, a country founded on racist principles via transatlantic slavery, a country that has never resolved its racial history, and we are seeing this more than ever in the year 2020. Their eugenics policies are much more overtly racist than I think the discussions of potential eugenics policies were in the UK. A figurehead of the female reproductive rights for women is Mary Stopes in this country. And the Mary Stopes clinics are all over the world, and they provide what I regard as essential, important reproductive advice and action in the form of abortions for women. And so we think of Mary Stopes as being associated with empowerment of women by giving them domain over their own bodies. Mary Stopes' interest in reproductive rights of women was because she was another massive eugenicist who really wanted to exterminate the Irish in London, who tended to be amongst the lower classes and poverty-stricken, but also Jews and Prussians. She was a deeply racist woman. And again, what a strange thing that we sort of celebrate her in the sense that she emancipated women and gave them reproductive rights, was part of that movement in the 1920s. But her motivations were the extermination of whole groups of people.
Yeah, well, there's a similar example with Margaret Sanger, the kind of American version of Mary Stopes, right? The founder of Planned Parenthood, who was equally a eugenicist. And yeah, it's similar to what we were talking about with statistics, asking this question of, well, why were they inventing methods for comparing groups? In this case of providing abortions and other reproductive health services, it's, well, why were they so concerned about certain women not giving birth? Of course, we now recognize that that's an essential health service, but at the time, it's worth discussing some of the other motives and how, like you said, those are kind of systemic and baked into the system. Another thing I wanted to touch on, which there's so much here, we could be here for hours, is just how much of this intellectualizing was served the sole purpose, not in the 20th century, but in the 19th and 18th, of justifying the Atlantic slave trade, right? Intellectuals need reasons to do things. And if you are, a person who is maybe a bit suspicious of the idea of buying and selling human beings and shipping them across the world in order to work for free on plantations, if you read a book that persuasively made the case that there was a hierarchy of races and that yours was at the top, then that might be reason enough for you to be able to participate in this thing. Perhaps not guilt-free, but at least you could, justify your work as being in some way backed up by the science or the pseudoscience. And so it's fascinating to see just how much of this stuff is explicitly designed with the intention of convincing people that this horrific enterprise is okay. But I understand that there is you are dedicating a future book to the study of a lot of these questions. Specifically, I want to turn back to the topic of the book that we're talking about, which is how to argue with a racist. So maybe we can get out of history for a second and talk about contemporary stuff and the actual science.
Well, let me chip in, Matthew.
Oh, yes, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, please.
What you just said there is you're completely right. And the thing is that you can't separate the history from the contemporary.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what we see in the justification, the pseudoscientific justification of people being different and inferior, and therefore that is a justification for subjugation. As part of that, you begin to see the roots of the stereotypes that are the fundamental tenets of the racism that we see today. They're baked into what Linnaeus is saying. They're baked into what Voltaire is saying. When you say this group of people are fickle or capricious and less intelligent or lazy, but they're strong, then that makes them both dehumanized and useful as a commodity, if you want to justify the transatlantic slave trade for in this specific example. And now in the current era where there isn't enslavement and the rights of humans are universal, the racialized mythologies or racialized stereotypes that people still cling to, and I'm not talking about white supremacists here, I'm talking about normal people who are non-racist, perhaps not anti-racist, but still harbor these views. But they are fundamentally rooted in the same pseudoscience that was first outlined in the 17th and 18th centuries. And I think that, one of the chapters in the book is about sport, and I love sports. I love watching it and I love playing it, but I recognize that not everyone does, and therefore I had to persuade my editor that I was going to devote 10,000 words to sport and race, because she just thought, well, this is not core. This is a separate book for sports fans. But I think it's really, really important in this discussion because you see, sports is one of the ways that we see the behaviors of people from the rest of the world at extreme abilities. And that's why we celebrate the Olympics and we celebrate, the great entertainment that comes in international competitive sports or national competitive sports.
Yeah.
But sports is massively racialized. And the stereotypes that sit within there are are completely, they're sort of overt and accepted, and again, we keep using that phrase, baked into our culture. So the idea that African Americans or black people are more athletic and better at short distance running sports because of their dominance in explosive energy running, like such as in the Olympics, 100 meters, or long distance in terms of the Kenyans and Ethiopian dominance in endurance sports, or in various aspects of both basketball and American football, and so on. There is this, many people think just intuitively black people are better at sports. Now, if there is a biological basis to that, well, there isn't. I mean, I could justify that in many ways. I go into great depth to explain why that is not the case. But the physicality of Africans and African Americans is a key idea that is sewn in place during the history in order to justify the enslavement of people. These people are strong and less intelligent, which means that they are both useful and we can commodify them. We can subjugate them in exactly the same way. The stereotypes about, for example, Jewish people being, well, good with money and intelligent are used to justify the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. These are exactly the language that is used to both other and create enemies, or use these sorts of ideas to justify persecution of Jewish people. They are smarter than us and better with money than us, and therefore they are a threat, and that is why they need to be eradicated. Now, but neither the data that supports those ideas is often worth scrutinizing, and I do some of it in the book because actually it turns out to be just simply not true. The period in which Jewish people were allowed to lend money was incredibly short historically, and was basically outlawed under most Ashkenazi Jewish policies for most of history. So where that, we're as much influenced by the characters like Shylock in Shakespeare, much more than history itself. And so, you can quite easily get to the point where you see, well, I haven't seen a white guy in the 100 meters final since 1980. And there are a lot of Jewish people in academia and in leading orchestras and solo violinists and chess grandmasters. And so these seem like good data sets to say, well, wait a minute, maybe there is something biological about Ashkenazi Jews, or something that happened to West Africans and their descendants during the transatlantic slavery, which means that what we see today is the biological evolution of these characteristics. Now, they're just not true. There's simply no genetic data in the 21st century which supports those ideas. If you do see disproportionate success in certain cultural or racialized groups, such as Jewish people or African Americans in certain sports, they are far, far better explained by cultural phenomena than genetic. But it's when it comes to, you mentioned the title of the book, How to Argue with a Racist. It's hard to persuade people that their experience is wrong. It's hard to say, well, I know that basketball is dominated and has been for 30 years by African Americans, but there isn't anything fundamental about African Americans that makes them better at explosive energy sports. In fact, it was Jews who dominated basketball for most of the 20th century, and indeed boxing. But we have such a sort of superficial understanding of our own history, or shallow understanding of our own history, and we're so bound to the way that these stereotypes is baked into our culture that it's really difficult to shake them. One of the studies that I cite in the book, which was from a couple of years ago now, documents 3,000 comments in top media about elite athletes. And in the vast majority of cases where a black athlete was being discussed, the references were to their physicality and their ancestry, right? And in the vast majority of cases where a white elite athlete was being discussed, the references in the same proportions were to their industriousness and their intelligence and their hard work. And I've ruined sporting events for many people by telling them this, because as soon as you have it pointed out to you, every time it gets mentioned, it's like a beacon and you see it. And I think that's an interesting battleground, because, we've all got an uncle or an aunt or a dad who watches sport and says very casually, in a way that isn't intended to be offensive, because everyone wants to be smarter or faster or more muscly or whatever, but says, black kids are better at football, soccer, in this country. And that's just the way it is. Or they're better at dancing. I can't dance. It's terrible. I'm white. I can't dance. Right? And you go, yeah, that's cool, because dancing is cool, and running fast is impressive, or being able to shoot hoops is impressive. But what those things do, well, one is they're not correct. There's no biological basis for them. But the second thing is they simply reinforce the structural racism that has existed for 300 years, that initially was used to justify slavery, and today is just a reinforcement of the hegemony of society that we exist in. So I think it's, we need to battle these things. We need to be equipped with the data and the understanding to say, Dad, you know what? That isn't how it works.
Yeah. Adam, you're sending me for a tizzy here. I mean, there's so much to say. One just to touch on the thing you said at the end, which is that, the nice thing here is that, like, science is on our side. Is that so much of racism and is just rooted in straight up, like, factual inaccuracy, or a lack of understanding of how genetics works, or how DNA works, or how culture works, or how history works, and the lack of recognition of, how much of the fates of humans is an extraordinarily complicated thing, that to boil it down to, black people are better at basketball or whatever it is just reductive and simplistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, that's kind of a nice feature of this, is that by reading books like yours and studying history and understanding how these things work, we can actually, have an informed opinion. But there's so much here. One thing I do want to mention is there's an amazing Key and Peele skit. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but Key and Peele are like anchors on a sports show, and there's a white guest, and they're analyzing all these American football plays, and and they're showing various pictures of players on the screen, and this commentator's going, to all the black players, his raw strength, his beastly abilities, and to all the white players, his incredible intelligence, his acuity. And it gets more and more absurd, to the point where the black players they're showing are the quarterbacks, the playmakers, the passers, the really kind of intelligent players, and the white players are just kind of these big brutes whose sole purpose is to stand there and push another guy. And nevertheless, that's the analysis, that they're giving.
Jordan Peele, it's a weird coincidence. I'm sitting here. It's so hot today. I'm just wearing a t-shirt, but I'm actually wearing a Jordan Peele t-shirt, which is from his second film, Us, the Hands Across America one. But that his first film, which I actually mentioned in the book, but that's fundamentally what it's about. It's about the fetishization of black bodies. Just like you described, when you look at when you look at a sport like American football, which requires a huge range of different physicalities and different skill sets, you see a very, very weird distribution of different racialized peoples in there. So for example, the linebackers always tend to the runners always tend to be sprinters, and they tend to be black. Quarterbacks always tend to be white. In the linebackers, the linesmen, there's a 50-50 split between black and white, apart from in the center position where it's 75-25. Now, like, when you start digging into the stats of sports, as I do like to do, they immediately become, racialized versions of these based on biology to explain those stats just immediately become nonsensical. They simply don't make any sense whatsoever if you're thinking that there is some biological basis for these types of characteristics. And it should be so obvious to say that, because if there's a genetic basis to running 100 meters, and that justifies the fact that we haven't seen a white guy in these races since 1980. Well, where are the black sprint cyclists or squash players?
Right.
or badminton players, all sports that require similar levels of explosive energy. The fact that there have only been two people of recent African descent, both African Americans, in the entire history of the finals of short distance swimming events in the Olympics makes no sense. I mean, you cannot explain this disparity using biology. And when Swim America, this is one of the subjects which I think this genuinely makes me angry. I mean, this all should make people angry, but this is something that I find particularly pernicious, which is that, well, the stats in America are that something like 70% of African Americans don't swim compared to 30% of white European Americans who don't swim. And there has been this long-standing myth that this can be best explained by bone density, that black people have higher density bones and therefore they sink, right? They have a buoyancy factor which is lacking, or which is less than in white Europeans. And this is why you see far fewer African-American swimmers at any level, at ground level all the way up to the top of the Olympics. Right. Well, the first thing is that myth comes from some pretty misunderstood osteoporosis actuary data, which I get into a little bit in the book, but it's just not correct to say that African Americans have more dense bones. The second thing is having more dense bones and not being able to float, or that being an impediment to swimming, isn't as absurd as it sounds.
Yeah.
But the third thing is, and this is the bit where I begin to get angry about this. This has become such a persistent stereotype that many black people believe this. And I know black people here, black British people, friends who have said this to me, seriously educated people saying, well, a friend who's British from Nigerian descent who says, well, we don't swim because we sink. I'm like, dude, you can't say that. You're a doctor, because it's not true. But when Swim America surveyed, you try to account for these disparities that they see in America by surveying people, African American people, the reasons for not swimming in African Americans are all socioeconomic, and all so obviously socioeconomic. So they're things like, well, even after segregation, swimming pools were built in white areas. So effectively segregation continues. Socioeconomic in that most swim lessons will be extracurricular, so they actually have a cost associated with them. No role models. We talked about that. Only two black swimmers in the history of the Olympics. The most important one, right, well, not having parents that swim, not having friends that swim, was number two. And the most important one was the reason that people don't swim of any color or race is that they don't get taught how to swim. Right? That's the single biggest factor in whether you swim or not. It's whether you were taught how to swim. Right? So that is a purely social thing. There aren't some people who can swim biologically and some people who can't. Everyone who can swim was taught how to swim.
Right.
It sounds ridiculous to have to say that, but the fact of the matter is that the death by drowning rate for African American children between the ages of 8 and 14 is 3 times higher than it is for European descended kids in America. So this is a kind of, it's a stereotype, a racialized stereotype, which is effectively a representation of structural racism in a domain which makes it literally lethal.
Yeah.
And I just think it's such a powerful thing to say, and so frustrating that, a sort of absurd, like biological buoyancy factor is more readily relied upon than the fact that people who swim have been taught how to swim.
Yeah. I'm reminded of so many other areas where people turn to, genetic explanations to explain phenomena that are so clearly just better explained through the fact of history. Like you mentioned, segregation. I mean, even if black people in America wanted to be able to swim, the opportunity to be able to do that was just so unavailable relative to their white counterparts for decades and decades, and continuing into the present day, right? There's a great movement right now that I've seen very active on Twitter about Black people exploring nature. And for so long, this idea of going on hikes or going camping was Black people were explicitly excluded. If you look at the history of the conservation or environmental movements, these were about preserving America's beautiful landscapes and keeping them pure and white away from the indigenous or African American or immigrant populations. Right? This was our beautiful American heritage. So it's not just that Black people are less interested in swimming or not good at swimming or not interested in hiking or whatever it is. It's that, like you said, it's baked into the system that these groups were explicitly excluded. And so to reach for a biological, or genetic explanation for those kinds of phenomena is like very perverse when, there's such a clear other story. And that applies as well. It's interesting because what you're talking about are maybe what we call maybe positive stereotypes. People would say like, well, what's wrong with me believing that Black people are better at running or playing basketball or jumping high? Because those are very positive things. Or as you said, dancing or playing music or whatever it is, because those are good things. It's good to be able to be good at basketball and jump high and play the saxophone. But the problem with that is that the exact same logic that is used to explain those stereotypes can then be flipped on its head to explain why people are receiving poor SAT scores or not doing well in school. So these positive stereotypes can just, you flip them on their head, and all of a sudden that's the kind of more classic racism that we're used to when we talk about discrimination. So really, like you say, I mean, I appreciate you talking about this, because when you bring it into clear relief with the swimming example, you really realize kind of how kind of deep-seated this illogic is.
Well, we're living through it right now. I think that it's such an obvious example with COVID that from March. So the edition that you've got, which came out last week, the UK version came out in February, just before all this, the world turned upside down. So it's got a new introduction. It's got a new essay at the beginning about the racialization of COVID and some reference to the Black Lives Matter and the murder of George Floyd. COVID was immediately racialized in two ways. The first was that its provenance. So the fact that it came from China meant that people started identifying it, started calling it the Chinese virus, which in of itself, as Trump himself said, well, it comes from China, I'm going to call it the Chinese virus. What about the Spanish flu? Actually, the Spanish flu was called the Spanish flu because during the First World War, Spain hadn't embargoed its press. It wasn't censoring its press. And so Spain was the first country to start reporting the fact that this pandemic was emerging. We don't actually know the origin of the Spanish flu in 1918. It may have come from Kansas, from a military base, from eating chickens. It may have come from France. We don't really know. But it's called the Spanish flu because the Spanish were reporting on it. So it immediately becomes racialized by saying it comes from China. I'm talking about COVID now, obviously. And I'm sorry to go on about Trump, but calling it the Chinese virus is the thin end of his racist wedge and that disease. And I don't want to repeat the other much more racialized terms he uses. But there were so many racist attacks on Chinese American people and Korean American people, because racism is fairly is sort of indiscriminate in its bigotry in America and all over the world. There was a kid from my university, from UCL, who was beaten up on Oxford Street in February. There have been so many that it has its own Wikipedia page. So racialized attacks on people of East Asian descent as a result of the current COVID pandemic. So that was the first way it was racialized. But the second way is much more in line with what we've just been talking about, which is the sort of desperation that people have in trying to explain things using a genetic or biological explanation, when in fact social factors are probably a much better explanation. So COVID, the data started coming in March, which was that in the UK, Black and Asian people seem to be much more susceptible to both infection and death. And in America, we had the sort of same stat, but including Hispanic or Latinx people as well. And so immediately people started saying, well, what is it? What is biologically similar about these people that means that they are more susceptible to to this particular infection. Well, that is a weird categorization of people anyway. I mean, that doesn't make any sense from a biological point of view, as far as we can tell. All it serves to do is to say white people and other people, right? And it's the other people who are more susceptible to this disease. There were attempts to explain it using vitamin D metabolism, which I think there is a sort of slightly interesting potential thread, which might have some sort of molecular biological inference associated with it. But the fact of the matter is that those groups of people are racialized medically anyway, because of socioeconomic reasons, because they tend to live in urban areas where infectious diseases spread more readily, because they tended to be in key worker positions and so were less likely to isolate, because they tend to live statistically in multi-generational families with older people for whom the death rate was far greater because they're more vulnerable, and so they're much more likely to get infected. All of these reasons are social or cultural or socioeconomic. And the reason we can say that with confidence is because we know it, right? We know this. We knew this 10 years ago, before COVID, before the current pandemic, because these are standard racializations that occur within medicine for social reasons. And yet, as soon as the data started coming out, I started getting messages saying, doesn't this demonstrate the biological reality of race, or isn't there something biological about these groups of people and their susceptibility? Well, I mean, there is I want to. It's worth stressing this point. I'm not a blank slatist at all. People are different around the world. People have different genetic makeups. We are physically different in certain ways, and we can see those things both with our eyes and in our genomes. None of those differences align with our folk taxonomies of race, and we've known that for decades. The classic example is sickle cell anemia, which is characterized as a black disease, but it's not a black disease. It's a disease associated with ancestry in areas of endemic malaria, because sickle cell trait is protective against malarial infection, and sickle cell disease is a consequence of that, the cost of that. So, we know about the differences between people and how they relate to the racialization of diseases. We know these things very well. Do they align with racial taxonomies? No, they do not. Are they important? Yes, they are. Are they, in this case, are they more important than the socioeconomic factors, which go a long way to explain the huge disparities in infection and death rates? No, they simply don't. We could fix those disparities with policy, not with genetics. There was one study about a few years ago, in fact, about the relative infant mortality rates between African Americans and white European descended Americans, which is far greater in African Americans. And it's only a couple of studies which show this, but one I thought was enormously significant was there's one place in America where opportunity or access to medicine is not racialized, and that is in the military. And guess what? The difference between infant mortality rates in black military African Americans as compared to white African Americans, it's non-existent. It doesn't exist at all. So, I don't know, it's frustrating.
Yeah. I wonder if we can go a little bit deeper into just this question of, like, what does race even mean? We were talking about this idea of black and African American. These concepts have social meaning in the sense that there are cultural groups within America and within other countries around the world who identify, culturally with a group of people and might use the label black or African American, but maybe genetically or medically, we use folk categorizations, as you said, to classify different races. But in terms of how our still quasi-Linnaean conception of race as it exists today in the world, we call people, Caucasian or white or Hispanic, Latinx. Do these actually correspond to anything real in terms of the genome, or are these just kind of convenient social inventions that we've used to categorize our social reality, but have no substantive basis in biology?
Well, as ever in biology, it's a bit of both. I
Right.
mean, we've got so good at genetics that we can, with a pretty fair degree of accuracy, predict ancestral origins for people based on their genomes. Now, just to go back to that earlier point that I said, these don't correlate well, certainly not perfectly, but not even particularly well with the sort of traditional groupings of as you say, quasi-Linnaean racial taxonomies of 5 groups of people. I mean, you said Caucasian there. In genetics, we're trying desperately hard not to use the word Caucasian anymore because it doesn't make historical or scientific sense. And yet in human genetics papers, we still see, references to the data set comprised 30% Caucasian people, and it's just something we're more and more aware of, and we're trying to spread the message that we don't actually have the right language to replace it, and that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
But I think you're asking about cultural identity here, which is so so important. It's many times when talking about race and saying that it's not a biological it's not biologically bound. It's not a biological phenomenon in the sense that it is a social construct. That people sometimes say, well, it's just a social construct.
Right.
They say, well, as a means of sort of undermining the argument.
Yeah.
You say race is just a social construct. Well, I mean, this is a completely nuts thing to say, because
Yeah.
almost all human interactions are social constructs.
Yeah.
Right? It's how we perceive people. We have the joke I make is that you have, unless you're extraordinarily good looking, you have very few biological interactions with people over the course of a life. We have social interactions with everyone that we meet. Time and money are social constructs, but you never get people saying, I'm not going to pay you because money is just a social construct. Right? These are socially agreed mechanisms by which we engage with other people or other phenomena in the world. So, again, I feel like I have to not tread on eggshells here, but just be cautious, because the temptation is to say, and well-meaning people do this all the time, and I think I've done it in the past, is to say, race doesn't exist, right? Because biology says that race is not a useful category. We say race doesn't exist. Well, race absolutely does exist. And it's important because it's a social construct, because we perceive race, and because we have decided over the last few hundred years that race is going to be one of the prime ways we talk about and interact with other people. So it's no good people like me saying the African American genome is not a cohesive thing. The history of the journey from African ancestry, mostly in West Africa, mostly via transatlantic slavery, into the Americas, the 12 million or so people who were forcibly taken from their families and homes, and their descendants, who number sort of 40 to 42 million in America now. To say, genetics, we've looked at your genomes and this isn't a sort of cohesive grouping of people, is not a useful thing to say, because people identify as African American because that is a cultural identity which is of enormous, complete importance for those self-describing groups of people. So it's where I've spent quite a lot of the last few years as a geneticist basically underplaying the significance of genetics, which is a slightly weird phenomenon for someone who's dedicated their life to being a geneticist.
Yeah.
But it's just that I think that throughout history, this goes back to the original history, people co-opting or marshalling science in order to justify their ideologies. It just continues to this day. It is the attempts to say my prejudices are founded on scientific principles, therefore it gives them greater credibility. And the arguments I present in the book are no, be bigoted if you want to be a racist if you want to be. But you can't have my tools.
Right.
You can't have my subject to justify that bigotry, because science says the opposite. Science says that race is not a biologically meaningful categorization, and here is why. Here are the arguments. The first line of the book is, this book is a weapon, and I really think it should be, because even though my science, and indeed all science, was built by racists in a time of racism in order to justify those political ideologies, which we now find odious. The trajectory of our history has meant that today science is categorically not an ally to racists, and is a weapon with which to fight them. And that is, dude, that's worth celebrating.
Yeah. Well, Adam Rutherford, thank you so much for speaking with me about these subjects today. Your book is hopefully a weapon that many people will carry around in their toolkit. The book is How to Argue with a Racist. It will show people, how to confront the racist ideas in their own life, maybe the ones that they didn't even consider before, like the ones you bring up in sport, and hopefully get all of us to reconsider some of our own prejudices and biases and evaluate in ourselves, because like you say, it's inbuilt into the culture we were raised in the society that we participate in. So we all have, a great deal of self-reflection to do, and your book is a good tool for helping us do that. So thank you for speaking with me about it today.
Thank you, Matthew. That was one of the most enjoyable interviews I've done, because you know as much about the subject. and I can't wait to tap you up for when I'm doing my eugenics book, which starts soon.
I appreciate that. All right. Thanks.